Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Master the NEC, the show live broadcast here at Electrical Code Academy. My name is Paul Abernathy, and thanks for joining me for yet another live stream. Now, we're continuing on in the episode of the 2023, trying to gear up and get ready for the 2023. And we're going to be looking at another article tonight. Tonight, we're going to be looking at Article 334, dealing in non-metallic sheath cable. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking you have pulled miles and miles and miles of NMB, non-metallic sheath cable. And you're thinking, what else could I possibly learn about non-metallic sheath cable? Well, we're going to see if we can teach you something tonight when you're dealing with non-metallic sheath cable. Cover the code aspects of it so you don't have any more of those issues on your inspections. Maybe you don't. Maybe you always pass your residential inspections. But nonetheless, that is going to be the topic for tonight's show. And thank you all for taking the time to join me. And we've got a lot we're going to cover. So we're going to look at Article 334. We're going to break it down. We're going to take a quick peek at the UL standard that is used by the manufacturers to actually create non-metallic sheath cable. And that is UL 719. So we're just going to take a quick peek at it. Again, I get it. Electricians out in the field don't have access to UL 719. Don't worry about it. The manufacturers will produce it. It'll be evaluated by a third party like UL, ETL, MET, any of the NRTL, nationally recognized testing laboratories that have the ability to evaluate non-metallic sheath cable. They'll look at it, okay? So that's what we're going to look at tonight. We'll look at a couple illustrations, and that's what we have on the agenda for tonight. So hopefully you'll buckle up and welcome. Again, I am not Dan Bongino. I am Paul Abernathy, and I'm not going to talk politics tonight. So rest assured, this is a politic-free zone tonight, even though I'd love to. It's not tonight. All right. If you also are joining me wherever you're at in the country, do me a favor in the chat. Feel free to shout out, say where you're at, where you're from. You have any success stories you want to shout out about, any recent things that you want to let everybody know that you've been successful on, shout it out. I'll share it here, and we'll give you some kudos. And again, we're all about making better electricians here. Now, before I get started, I want to tell you I am so excited that we are streaming on so many platforms now. Thank you to Restream for giving us the ability to be able to stream on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitch, Twitter, Facebook. We're even now streaming on our new platform, Fast Tracks Tube. Okay, and I'll talk about that in a minute because we have some giveaways that I want to let you know about. But we're also streaming on LinkedIn as well. So you should be able to catch our show on so many different platforms. And they do rebroadcast throughout the week. So you may catch a rebroadcast. That's okay. It'll say live because I can't control that. But it will technically be live, and you never know who's actually in the chat room. You know what? I might be lurking. Brittany might be lurking. You never know who might be in there. Jeff might be lurking. We know Schwartzy will always be lurking. So again, feel free to watch the videos in the replay and share it with everybody. Okay? All right. So first thing I want to let you know is Fast Tracks Tube. You see it scrolling across the bottom. It is live. We're adding new videos every day. And the videos are not just my videos. We're going to be adding videos from other educators. And what happens is, you know how you've seen that little thing on Twitter? And I guess it's like some of those social media platforms, they have this little icon that says verified. So anything that we put on Fast Tracks Tube is verified. So if another educator's video is on it, you can rest assured that it's verified. And that's what the process of the subscription is, because we have to go through and look at every video, because we're not just going to let any video go on there. Okay. So it's one of those things that we're going to make sure that we keep it very electric specific. And that's the whole focus of the Fast Tracks Tube. If you're interested in the Fast Tracks Tube, I will let you know that You can scan that barcode right there on the screen, or you can go to fasttrackstube.com. If you're watching this on your desktop, you take out your phone, scan that barcode, it'll take you right there. Make sure you register for a free account. Why would I tell you to do that? Well, guess what? We are giving away 50 annual memberships, a value of $125 a piece. We're giving those away randomly to 50 people that sign up for the free account. Now, how will you know if you win? Well, if you log in, that's why we keep you coming back. If you log in and you get access to all the exclusive videos, guess what? Then you know that you were actually selected. So that's how you know. Don't look for an email. You're not going to get anything like that. And I just noticed that it seems like that I am going in and out of color a lot. I don't know. There you go. Maybe that's it. I don't know what that is. Anyway, so that's how you do it, folks. So if you're interested in it, again, I'll put it on the screen right there. You can scan that barcode or go to fasttrackstube.com. You see it scrolling across the bottom. Make sure you sign up for the free account. Although if you want to subscribe, we'd love to have you and we appreciate your patronage. But again, if you want to take a chance at the free annual membership, $125 value, just go over there and sign up for a free course, free account. Okay. All right, let's get into this here tonight. All right, so the first thing we want to do is let's go on and look at UL 719, because we always want to look at, we're using a product, a non-metallic sheath cable, and we want to know, okay, when I get it in my hands as an electrician, what does it actually go through? What is the process that we have to follow? All right, so let's kind of go over here and look. So here you go. This is UL 719 for non-metallic sheath cable. And something that you may find interesting is right here. I don't know if I can zoom in on this enough. I might be able to right here. And let's see if I can get it right there. So interesting enough, look at when non-metallic sheath cable, the UL standard for non-metallic sheath cable first came about, right here. 1927, believe it or not. That's when non-metallic sheath cable actually had a UL standard, okay? So it's been used a long time ago. In fact, again, it's coming up on, let's see, that would be coming up on 100 years or over 100 years, okay? That since this has been, or coming up on 100 years. So that's a long time, right? We looked at, just a couple nights ago, we looked at flexible metal conduit, and I believe that was 1924. So that's going to be 100 years next year. So we're in the 90-some years. It's going to be, gosh, that's amazing to think that non-metallic sheath cable has been around that long. Let's see what we got in the room real quick. See what we got. Juan, why is non-metallic sheath cable of the Romex type not allowed in places like New York City? Romex is a trade name, by the way, for a Southwire. But it's really non-metallic sheath cable, so everybody just calls it Romex. But again, that's very specific to that manufacturer. But we all know what we're talking about when we say Romex, right? So in New York, it's also kind of not liked in Chicago, in the urban area in Chicago either. Again, one of the big issues probably is in New York City, unless you're talking downtown, is a typically, and you're going to see uses permitted and uses not permitted here shortly. But interesting enough, even the buildings down there that might be type 1 or type 2 construction, that's brick and that's like concrete and steel, they could have non-metallic sheath cable in it if they're type 1 or type 2, if it's put in a raceway. So there are some rules, but that's not obviously any specific to New York. Every jurisdiction's different. So there's and one of the other big things that people don't like, and I'm going to say it here, same as with Chicago, same as with New York, it tends to be a union thing. And people feel like it lowers the level of craftsmanship to use something flexible like that. They want to put in raceways, conduits, and they want to bend it and all this stuff. And so, again, it's been a strong pushback around the country not to use. And it's the same thing for MC cable. For example, in Chicago area, they do not like MC cable. Now, out in the suburbs, they don't have a problem with it, and it's starting to move around a little more. But inside the city, they just don't like it. And it is because very union controlled. and it's easy to put in. And some of the old timers feel that it's not a good representation of craftsmanship. I disagree. I think you can do a really nice looking MC job, and I think you can do a real nice looking non-metallic sheath cable job. But again, code is the code, but you do have local amendments, you have local rules, you have people in place that may say, no, we're not going to let you use a non-metallic sheath cable. Okay, so that's the real reason. It's certainly nothing in the NEC that prohibits it. So that is very much specific, that type of thing. The interesting thing is ask somebody in authority in that area why they don't allow to use non-metallic sheath cable. And I don't know that to be the case. I'm just based on what Juan is stated, that type of thing. Let's see here. Mr. G is watching via Facebook, and I'm currently in PR, but I hail from New York City. Oh, you're out in Puerto Rico, but you hail from New York City. Okay, what do they allow it in Puerto Rico? I'm not sure. I would think so. All right. So, but thanks for joining me tonight. Joseph, always watching me from New Jersey. Thank you again, my friend. Thanks for joining me. All right. So let's look at that UL standard real quick, just so y'all kind of know. So here's the standard, and obviously it covers everything from the individual conductors that are typically for non-metallic sheath cable. The conductors are typically equivalent to TW or THHN, but they don't have the nylon. So they're equivalent to THHN, but they don't necessarily have to be THHN. Now, can I use THHN in a non-metallic sheath cable? Absolutely. But there's nothing in the UL 719 that actually requires me to put any markings on the individual conductors that are inside that cable assembly. Okay, so people ask me all the time, can I just strip those conductors out and use them? No, the moment you take them out of that cable assembly, you now have conductors that have no markings on them. All right, so and if that's the case, then that wouldn't be in accordance with the 719 that was created for it. Okay, that type of thing. So and you'll see a little bit that, again, it has a lot to do with where you're going to use the product as well. Okay. All right. But keep the questions coming in the comment area. And again, shout out, let me know where you're coming from. And we will start getting into this now a little bit deeper. All right. So you'll see all of the insulation requirements, conductor requirements, the assembly, how they're supposed to be arranged, whether they're parallel or they're plexed. Okay, twisted like with the 14.3. Believe it or not, they can be plexed or they can be run all parallel. It's perfectly fine. That's the more flatter cable that we're seeing today. The different flame tests that are required on it. Typically, non-metallic sheath cable would not be something, for example, that you would see for use in a cable tray. However, we can test it for that. And if that's the case, then it will get what's called a CT use rating, and that will be stamped on the sheathing, and then you could put it in a cable tray. But don't assume that all non-metallic sheath cable can go on a cable tray. You got to look for the markings that are on the side of it. And who does all those markings? The manufacturer, and they follow 719. That's why we're kind of giving it a quick look at it. All right, so you'll see in here, it's got all the tests you have to do, crush and tension and elongation on the insulation of the individual conductors. Testing pull-through joist tests, where it actually is an apparatus that's set up and it shows how it pulls through bored holes. We have to do that test. And you see all of the marking requirements, what is and what can and can't be. I'll click on the marking, for example, right? See, all printing on the outer surface of finished cable or anywhere within a cable shall be legible and shall be repeated at intervals throughout the length of the cable. Okay, and then it's going to end up giving you the intervals down here. So that's on the sheathing. So again, if we wanted to use conductors inside of it that had the markings on it, then we could. But typically the manufacturers don't do that. Okay. So I just wanted to look at 719 briefly, just so you know that is the standard. So when you buy a product, non-metallic sheath cable, you know that it has to go through a litany of tests. It'll also get tested to UL 2556, which is a test standard for UL. This is the standard for the construction of it, okay? So all of that type of stuff is, again, all done by UL 719. So if you're not familiar with it, it's not something you're going to keep in your truck, right? It's something that the manufacturers make sure that by the time you get the product, that it's a compliant product, that type of thing, all right? All right, so let's go on and dig in now. And what we're going to do now, let's go on and start jumping into the National Electrical Code. All right, so what you see here is the National Electrical Code, and we're looking at Article 334, non-metallic sheath cable, type NM and NMC. Now, interesting fact here, NM cable is non-metallic, NMC is non-metallic, but the C talks about it being in a corrosive environment, okay? None of the manufacturers really make NMC, okay? We make NM cable. They don't typically make NMC. We now make a product called NMPCS, which has the power conductors in it, and it has the 0 to 10 volt control in the same cable assembly. That is becoming something that people are buying. I don't see the need for it because most of the time in a dwelling, we got Wi-Fi and everything anyway, but people wanted it, and so the manufacturers produced it. It's not the same as the one for MC cable, which I happen to hold patents for. That's a different thing because MC cable used in commercial, that is a real relevant thing where they need to have lighting controlled on an automated system. Not so much in a dwelling, but it is available. So when you see NM, non-metallic, and you see NMC, the substitute for NMC, because most of the manufacturers don't make that, and you'll see it here in a second, we'll look at it. The reason is because they use UFB, underground feeder and branch cable. So they use UFB rather than NMC. Now, interesting thing, so I get this out of the way, just a fun fact. NM is not, all of it's non-metallic sheath cable. The dash B that you'll see on the NM that you buy today, the dash B is only to signify that the conductors inside of that cable assembly are rated 90 degrees C. Now, why would that be important? Well, later you're going to see when it comes to adjustment and corrections, I can use that 90 degree rated insulation to do an adjustment or correction, maybe in contact with thermal insulation, or maybe more than two cables bundled together, and I have to do some kind of a correction or an adjustment. I can use the 90, but ultimately I still can't exceed the value under the 60 degree column. Now that's in 334.80. We're going to look at that. But I want you to know that that dash B, if you've ever wondered what it means, it just means that the insulation on the conductors inside of the cable are rated for 90 degrees C. Might not be able to use it in the real world, but it's rated for that, and it's only for adjustment and corrective purposes. The other thing that I tell people all the time is the sheathing on a non-metallic sheath cable is not insulation. It's the sheathing. So I have people contacted all the time and say, well, the outside insulation is ripped. No, it's the outside sheathing is ripped. You can't repair the insulation. I'm going to say this with tongue in cheek here. You cannot repair the insulated conductors if you strip off the insulation and the copper's exposed, because only a manufacturer can put insulating material on a conductive. Not talking about a splice where you're stripping it off intentionally to put another insulated device on it. We're talking about just stripping the insulation off the conductor. Now, most electricians will just reach for the electrical tape. And again, it's your jurisdiction, it's your install. But putting tape on it is not equivalent to the insulation that would be on there from a manufacturer. So we're so careful not to damage the insulated conductors. But what about the sheathing? Okay, so the sheathing can be repaired. So don't let anybody tell you it can't. 3M, other companies make a cable repair tape that is designed to repair the sheathing. We're not talking about insulation. It's the sheathing that can be repaired, okay? Now, of course, if you have conductors inside of the cable that are damaged, then think about splicing it in a junction box, things like that. So there's other options, but again, wrapping it in tape or taking some damaged non-metallic sheath cable that for some reason it got damaged, let's say by the plumber or the mechanical guy, you know you were running your cable in their way and they just cut you out. Well, you can't just take it, strip back the sheathing and tape the conductors and then repair it like that. If the insulation's gone off the conductors inside, then you're going to have to splice it or replace it, okay? Now, there's people out there that say, hell no, I'll just put tape on it. That's fine. You do you if that's what you need to do. Okay. All right. So let's go on in and move back into the code and start looking at these things a little bit. All right. So first thing we'll notice here is the scope. What do I say? We always have to look at the scope to see what we're talking about here. What is the scope? Well, this article covers the use, installation, and construction specifications for non-metallic sheath cable. NMB is what you're going to see today. Okay. Again, like we saw the other night when we were dealing with flexible metal conduit, FMC, under 348, the article 348. Get used to these articles, folks, especially if you're somebody who's preparing for an electrical exam. It's going to be so much easier for you to be able to rattle these things off and you go to the code book in the field if you start learning them. Well, .6 is consistent again in the 2023 edition. This is the listing requirements. Now, most all cables that you're going to find in Chapter 3, well, I'll say all cables have to be listed. So in this case, it's no different. Type NM and type NMC cables and the associated fittings that are for use with this cable assembly shall be listed. Listed for use. The fittings have to be listed for use for NM cable. All right. And that in the NM cable itself has to be obviously UL listed. All major manufacturers, Encore Wire, Southwire, Ciro, Service Wire, what's another one? A real popular one. Let's see here. CME. All of those that manufacture non-metallic sheath cables are all going to have theirs evaluated to 719. Usually they have the inspectors come to your facility, your plant, and they will evaluate it before you can even put that little mark on there, no matter who the NRTL is. Okay, so they're listed. You can know that. Now, you get something from China or something from overseas, all bets are off. Okay, so work with those major manufacturers because they're the ones that you're going to be buying listed products from. All right, so that's it for part one. Pretty simple, straightforward. Now we're getting into part two, and this is the installation part of it. And we have the same, if you're preparing, for those out there that are preparing for an electrical exam, right? These are some of the things you just commit to memory, right? Dot 10 is uses permitted. Dot 12 is uses not permitted. Now, uses permitted is not an all-inclusive list, but it's a list that we have in the NEC, and it typically covers most of the applications. Anything else outside of that, you would simply consult with your local AHJ. They have the authority to do something about it. They have the discretion, and some people like that, some people don't like that, but they do in their jurisdiction. The thing that the inspectors have to be careful about is just winging it, all right? So they need to make sure that what they do and what they might allow is not going to get them in trouble or get their jurisdiction in trouble, that type of thing. But they have that ultimate authority, so it behooves you to work with them. But if the code is black and white, then you simply follow the code. All right, so let's look at uses permitted here. So NM cable and NMC cable shall be permitted to be used in the following, except prohibited by 334.12. So what is it saying? I'm going to give you the list. I'm going to give you kind of an example of each one. And it says that they're permitted in all of these situations except where excluded or prohibited in 334.12, because what? Dot 12 is the what? Use is not permitted. Okay. All right, very first one. Number one, and we'll see if this applies to New York. Let's look at this and see. Hey, Swartzy's in the house. Okay, welcome, Swartz. Swartz, by the way, folks, is a moderator over at Fast Track's chat, and he's a moderator at the Sparky Hub. So if you go over there, you mess up, you got to answer to Schwartzy there. He's the one that wields the mighty sword over in those locations. Okay. All right. Juan says NM cable was the workhorse of conductors used in Puerto Rico in the 1950s up until the late 70s. But as a transition was made in the residential and commercial construction trade towards concrete buildings, EMT became the raceway of choice. All right. Very good. Very good. We have a little history of Puerto Rico there. Thanks for sharing. All right, so let's now look here. Number 1 and 2 family dwellings and their attached or detached garages and their storage buildings. Makes sense. So I can do a one and two family dwelling, and then any accessory building, whether it's attached like the garage or a detached garage, if it's part of the 1 or 2 family dwelling, then I can use non-metallic sheath cable in there as well. Makes sense, right? Should be able to. What's the difference? So that's okay. Next one, number 2, says multifamily dwellings and their detached garages permitted to be of the type 3, 4, and 5 construction. So 3, 4, and 5 deals with things like wood construction, heavy timber. Think wood, okay? If you think of type 1 and type 2, think of concrete and steel. Think of type 3, 4, and 5 is some type of wood construction. So in a multifamily dwelling, and then they might have separate garage units, and a lot of these big complexes, right? They're doing, we've got some here in Texas, as you go out 380, there's some really big multifamily. And they've got these little kind of like garage cabanas that are out behind the residential units. But they're associated with the multifamily dwelling. So the multifamily dwelling is utilizing non-metallic sheath cable. So I would accept the same thing down in those detached garages that are accessories to that multifamily. I have no problem with that at all. Okay, it seems very plausible to me to be able to do that. All right, the next one that people forget about here is number 3. And I'm going to see if I can't blow this up a little bit better for everybody. Hopefully this works. And if I block it with me, I'm sorry, I can't shut me down. I learned a couple videos ago that when I close my camera, it turns off the mic. So we don't want to do that. All right, so here we go. Number 3, other structures. And again, this is other structures other than type 3, type 4, type 5, I guess. It's other structures. It could be commercial buildings, not just multifamily. There's a lot of one-story strip malls that are wood framed, right? That are type 3, 4, 5 construction. And obviously, I can use non-metallic sheath cable for that. So it says other structures permitted to be type 3, 4, and 5 construction. So some type of wood construction, all right? And also, if you want to see some examples of type 3, 4, and 5 construction, don't forget that you can go into your code book and you go down to the informative annexes. And in the informative annexes, you have what's called informative annex E, and it talks about the type of construction. So it gives you some examples of type 3, type 4, type 5, all those type of things. So in case you ever wonder, and you're not like an IRC person, or you're not like a international building code person, you're just an electrician and you're doing multifamily or big buildings, you're like, I don't give a darn about those construction requirements. All I know is the plan said I could use NMB. Well, it's good to know when you can and when you can't. I've seen quite a few one-level storage units and one-level office buildings that were all done in type 3 or mostly type 3 construction, right? Just wood framing members, or type 5 construction typically. Typically not heavy timber type 4, but of the wood construction. And people were like, oh, it's commercial. You can't use non-metallic sheath cable. That's not true. That is not true at all. Okay, if it's type 3, type 4, type 5, it's easy to find that out. If it is that type of construction, then guess what? I can use non-metallic sheath cable. Another interesting thing that people don't understand sometimes while we're talking about it is if I have an office building, 1 level or 2 level, whatever, that's wood construction because it's type 3, 4, or 5. And what if, let's say it's in Arizona, what if they're worried about termites? And now they decide they want to do it in metal studs. Does that change anything? No. If it was allowed to be done in type 3, 4, or 5 construction, and they choose to use metal studs, then that's okay. Just got to make sure you put full grommets through all the punches. But other than that, if it was allowed to be type 3, 4, or 5, and you made a design choice to make it metal studs, that's okay too. It's perfectly fine to use non-metallic sheath cable. Okay, so the moral of the story is you really got to know what the type of construction is you're working with. But if you see wood, chances are you're going to be okay with a non-metallic sheath cable, unless there's any amendments, obviously, in your local jurisdiction. Because years ago, it used to limit the use of non-metallic sheath cable to 3 stories. Well, it used to say it that way. Now the limitation is based on the type of construction. Right? So it might allow you to go up to 3, 4, even 5 stories if you have sprinkling. That would allow you now to use type 3, type 4, type 5 construction. Then obviously you could use non-metallic sheath cable in that as well. So really pays you to understand construction types if that's something new for you. All right. All right, so let's keep on going here. It says now, in these other types of construction here, these other structures, it says the cables shall be concealed within walls, floors, or ceilings that provide a thermal barrier of material that has at least a 15-minute finish rating as identified in the listings of fire-rated assemblies. And of course, you've got this little note down here that talks about the different occupancies and classifications and NFPA 220. That's another place you can go to learn all about the different construction types. Typically, the 15-minute fire rating is going to be something as simple as gypsum board. We're not trying to go the 5/8 that's much thicker for a fire rating. We're just typically the 15-minute rating would be something like typical drywall or gypsum board would be adequate to give you that 15-minute rating. Okay. But obviously, you can get the gypsum in a higher rating and much thicker as well. So, but that's just your general rule for that. Okay, so can I use it in other structures other than 1 family and 2 family and multifamily? Absolutely. As long as it's type 3, type 4, type 5 construction, and as long as the cables are installed concealed in the walls, in the floors, or in the ceilings by a thermal barrier of at least what? 15-minute finish rating, okay, and should typically be, normal 1/2-inch gypsum. All right. Next, number 4. Believe it or not, cable trays in structures permitted to be types 3, 4, and 5. So again, 3, 4, and 5, wood construction. Okay. Now, could it be metal construction? Absolutely. If it was permitted to be type 3, 4, or 5, but you choose to do it in metal studs, that's okay. Because it could have been wood. You just chose to use metal. That's a design type of thing. Okay? All right. Next would be, and also I should mention this so everybody knows, and I said it kind of earlier, not every non-metallic sheath cable can go in a cable tray, even if it was type 3, 4, or 5. Why? Because it has to have a CT or cable tray use or CT use marked on the side of the cable. It's pretty rare to use cable trays in that type of construction, okay? It is pretty rare. It permits you to do it, but if you're picking a non-metallic sheath cable, make sure you pick one that has CT use if that's your application. Again, pretty rare, but if you need that, just make sure you double check what's printed on the side. Now, most all of the manufacturers have what's called product sheets. They're all available to download from their websites. So, they have everything on it. Encore Wire has them, Southwire has them, Ciro has them, CME has them, all those type of things. They're available. And that'll give you all the information. Now, they're not engineering specs. Those are just product sheets. And they're usually designed to call out important features of the product. Applications, features, things like that. Okay, they're not really to be for engineering purposes. Okay, but on them you can see whether it's CT rated or not. And if it's not, you can't use it in a cable tray. Makes sense? All right. Moving on down the line here. Next, number 5, and again, we're still in the uses permitted. It is type 1 and type 2 construction were installed within raceways permitted to be installed in type 1 and 2 construction. So I don't know if there's an expansion to show that, but here you go. So here's the different types. It's quite interesting. Type 1 is fire resistive. Type 2 is non-combustible. Okay, so concrete and brick. Okay, or you could have a type 1 that's fire resistive material. Typically, brick and concrete and steel would be that anyway. And then the type 3, 4, and 5, as you can see here, is a combination of combustible and non-combustible. And then, of course, type 4 is heavy timber. That's big, heavy timber construction. And then, of course, type 5, which is what we see mainly, is just plain old wood construction. Now, type 3, 4, and 5 all have an element of what? Typically going to be wood. Obviously, type 3, even though it doesn't say wood, it is combustible, right? So type 3, 4, and 5 are typically going to be something to do with wood. Type 1 and type 2, concrete, steel, brick, things like that. Okay, now, what did our question just say? Okay, our item here, number 5, did say that I can put non-metallic sheath cable inside a type 1 and type 2 construction. Right? However, it still has to be what? The raceway or the wiring methods that are in type 1 and type have to be rated for that type of construction. And then and only then can I put a non-metallic sheath cable in it. So, actually this becomes some of the root questions that people ask me all the time is I say, Paul, can I put non-metallic sheath cable in a raceway? Now, you're all familiar with putting it in a raceway to protect it from physical damage. And we do that all the time, right? Well, here it's giving you expressed permission to put that non-metallic sheath cable in a raceway that is able to be used in a type 1 and type 2 construction. Now, I don't know why you do it. Maybe you're doing wood framing and then there's some kind of separation wall, or I don't know. I don't even know when you would do this. Somebody out there probably knows when you would do this, because I typically wouldn't take a type 1 and type 2 construction and sleeve NMB through there to be able to use it. I wouldn't do it, but this says you can do it. Okay, so if you happen to run into it, there you go. Maybe you have a roll of NM cable in the truck. That's all you have. And you're out of wire and you ran down and you've got the raceways in and you're like, oh, crap. What am I going to do? Oh, I got some of this NM cable. I'll just use it. Okay, just be aware of this rule. Okay. All right, now, we're still in the uses permitted, and now we're going to get specific, and this is type NM cable. All right, so this is NM. This is not NMC. Now, I will remind you of something, folks. Type NM also covers the new stuff that you're seeing called NMPCS. Okay, it's still a non-metallic. It just has a designation for power and signaling and control. That's the PCS, okay, or power control and signaling. Right, that's for that 0 to 10 control. Now, again, I don't see a big need for that in dwelling applications because now with Wi-Fi and Bluetooth and all that, I don't see a big need, but it's there and it can be used. Okay, so now it used to be NMS, and we removed NMS a cycle or two ago, and now it's been replaced with NM. But the PCS is just a form of NM. So I didn't want any inspector out there looking at this new NM PCS stuff that's out of the market and go, I'm sorry, you can't use it because it's not mentioned here in the NEC. No, it's still non-metallic sheath cable. It's just a designation PCS. Okay, and that just tells you there's power and signaling and control in the same cable assembly. That's all it says. It's still just plain NM cable. So all the rules we're going to see right here for permitted uses apply to that product as well. Okay, in case there was any confusion with that. All right, so NM cables shall be permitted where? In both exposed and concealed work in normally dry locations, except as prohibited in 334.10.3. Okay, so we're going to look. Okay, and 334.10.3, again, in this location down here, okay? So if it's prohibited in 334.10.3, except where prohibited, and again, 334.10.3 is right here, and I don't see anything here. It's just got to, if it's other structures, then it simply has to follow these rules, and it has to be behind the 15-minute finish rating and that type of thing, okay? And that's that rule, okay? So it can be exposed and it can be concealed, except in 334.10.3, where other structures permitted to be type 345, it's going to want you to put it behind what? A 15-minute finish rating. That's what it means when it says except as prohibited in 334.10.3. You get me? That's what it means. All right. So it's a dry product, folks. The conductors inside of it are not evaluated to be used. It's not a wet location product. It is a dry location only product. Now, let's talk about some of the things that people ask me. Well, Paul, can I install non-metallic sheath cable in my crawl space because that's a wet location or a damp location? Not necessarily. Okay? Not necessarily. Because I promise you something. If that was a wet location, chances are usually the first floor of that building is not treated lumber. And so if that was not treated lumber, then that would be a problem. It's not in contact with the earth. It might be up a little bit above a crawl space, but typically they put in insulation and everything like that. They're not banking on that being a wet location or even a damp location, okay? This is going to be very specific to your jurisdiction, how they feel about this. To me, a crawl space, properly vented, is a dry location. No different than if my basement floods because of a storm, doesn't turn it into a wet location. It's still a dry location. No different than inside of my bathroom in my house, just because my shower might steam up things, doesn't make the location in the bathroom a wet location. Now, we're not talking about in the bathtub space or the shower space. We're just talking in general. So you're going to have to work with your AHJ, but hopefully they're going to be a little bit understanding that, crawl spaces, just because it's in a crawl space does not make it, by virtue of being in a crawl space, a wet or damp location. Okay? And a lot of this, again, is going to be the determination inspector. It should not be that wet and that damp underneath your crawl space. Enough that would be needing to call it a wet or damp location. Let me tell you why. Because when we evaluate NM cable, it is submerged in water. Not the conductors, but the sheathing is submerged in water and tested. So, if you get a little moisture on the sheathing, it's no big deal. If it's in the ceiling and you have a flood on the second floor and water runs over top of the sheathing, it's no big deal. However, if water gets into the ends of the cable, that's a big deal. Okay? So I encourage you to also get the NEMA evaluating water damage document and read what that says. It was created by all of the manufacturers coming together with NEMA and writing that document. You can Google it and find it. But I'm telling you, not all crawl spaces are determined to be wet or even damp locations. It's all very specific to the local jurisdiction, and they're already going to have well-established rules if that's the case. Okay. I've done many a crawl space, and many of them were not wet or even damp locations. They were dry as a bone. So again, very specific, and it's going to be an AHJ call. All right, next, number 2, use is permitted again to be installed. So they're permitted to be installed in installed or fished in air voids of masonry block or tile walls. Okay, that's the air void. Okay, didn't say anything about embedding it, putting it in any mortar. It says the air voids. Okay, so if you need to fish it from point A to point B, and then maybe it's completed and you need to get it, then you can definitely fish it in those air voids of masonry block or tile wall. Okay, and I don't see any enhancement here or anything like that. So there you go. So that's for the NM. Now, what about this NMC? Now, we'll go this really quickly because I told you NMC is not something you're going to be able to readily go grab out on the market. Okay, it's not something you're going to find. So NMC, what do we use as a replacement for NMC, folks? If you ever wanted to know, UF cable is exactly what we're going to use as a replacement for NMC. Okay, so, but it's in the code, so we got to look at it. So NMC cable shall be permitted to be one for both exposed and concealed work in dry, wet, damp, or corrosive locations. again, except as prohibited in 334.10.3, which means it needs behind a 15-minute finish rating when it's other structures other than a one family, two family, or a multifamily. Okay, same rule there as you had before for the non-metallic sheath cable. All right, so interesting, right? So this is an NMC that allows for you to use it to dry, wet, or damp, or even corrosive. Well, isn't that similar to what UF cable can be used in? That is Article 340, and we will be doing that in an upcoming episode as well. So make sure you stick around for that because it's a very unique, hard to strip cable assembly. All right. Next, NMC can be in outside and inside walls of masonry block or tile. Okay, so you can put it in those walls, not a problem. Number 3, it says in shallow chases in masonry, concrete, or adobe, protected against nails or screws by a steel plate at least 1/16 of an inch thick and covered with plaster, adobe, or similar finish. Okay, so you need to get it down a wall. You're able to, with NMC, you're able to actually chip out a chase, cut out a chase, lay the cable in there, put a protective plate over it, a 1/16 inch, like a nail plate, but this would be a long running plate. You put it over the entire groove that you cut down to wherever your box is going to be cut into. And as long as you do that, and then you can finish over it, plaster over it, or whatever, and you're done. So you can't do that, right, with NM cable, but you can do that with NMC. And incidentally, you could also do that with UF. Okay, so there you go. All right, so those are your permitted uses. Is that a word? Maybe not. All right, next, let's start looking at where you can't. 334.12, uses not permitted. Okay, all right, so the very first one, A, this is for type NM and NMC. So both of these, use not permitted. Number 1, in dwelling or structures not specifically permitted in 334.10, 1, 2, 3, and 5. Well, you remember what those were? Those were not, so it's okay in 1 and 2. It's okay in multifamily. It's okay how it's stipulated here in other. And let's see here, and 5. And it is okay in type 1 and 2 construction. Okay? So, all right. So it's not permitted in any dwelling or structure that is not specifically listed in the uses permitted that we just went through. If it's not one of those, guess what? Boop, can't use it. Next, NM and NMC, exposed within a dropped or suspended ceiling cavity in other than 1 and 2 family and multifamily dwellings. Interesting one, right? So you've heard this for years. I cannot put non-metallic sheath cable above a suspended ceiling in a commercial building, okay? But I can in a 1 and 2 family, which sometimes will have little drop ceilings in there. I can have it above that. And I can have it in the multifamily dwellings. Okay, look, be very careful. Sometimes the multifamily dwellings, depending on how it's classified, you have common corridors and you have the multifamily dwelling itself. And it is okay above the suspended ceiling in the multifamily dwelling, but when you get out into those corridors, they might be classified by your jurisdiction as commercial, and then you would not be able to put it above a suspended ceiling in the commercial location, but you would in the multifamily dwelling location, okay? One way around that is usually if there's drop ceiling in the multifamily dwelling units, that in the common corridor, it's a finished rating, and usually is just finished gypsum board rating, okay? So this is specifically telling you about being exposed, and it's okay in 1 and 2 family, and it's okay in a multifamily dwelling. It is not okay in other applications, commercial, things like that, all right? All right, next one is obviously as a service entrance cable. Okay, so you can't use NM cable as a service entrance cable. Makes sense. Number 4, in commercial garages having hazardous classified locations as defined in 511.3. And of course, 511.3 is talking about area classifications, and this starts talking about class 1, class division 1, division 2, all that. So obviously you can't have it in those locations as is specified here. And it just reminds you of that, okay? So you can't have it in commercial garages having a hazardous classified locations. Now, number 5, in theaters and similar locations except where permitted in 518.4c. So this is places of assembly. So I can't have it in theaters. Typically, they're going to be over 100 people. That's the threshold for places of assembly. And I can't, for example, a church. I couldn't have it in a church in the area where it's the places of assembly. However, I could possibly use it out in the administrative areas, out where they're maybe framing up their offices or things like that, that don't have the same classification as the area that's specifically listed as for place of assembly, and that's going to kick in the requirements for this. So again, different applications. So we'll click on this so you can see it right there. And here it says, in addition to the wiring methods permitted in 518.4a, non-metallic sheet cable, electrical non-metallic tubing, and rigid non-metallic tubing shall be permitted to be installed in those buildings or portions of those buildings that are not required to be fire-rated construction by the applicable building code, okay? So if you were to look here to the left, just to show you, 518, right here, assemblies. So if you have the assembly area where people gather, typically the separation from the, say, administrative areas and the actual place of assembly will usually be a rated assembly. It'll have a rated wall, 2-hour ratings or whatever. So there's a separation. In that area, no, where you're going to have the place of assembly. But out in maybe the offices, absolutely, you should be able to use it. That's not a problem. So be very careful. 518 can be your friend if you're doing anything, theaters, churches, whatnot, that have areas that are places of assembly. Also remember that many buildings like that will have multiple classifications within a building. It's not unheard of to have a building that has a bunch of different classifications, right, in one building. So you just have to be careful, okay, when you're working with that. All right, obviously we can't use it in a motion picture studio. We can't use it in storage battery rooms because of the potential for the fumes and corrosive conditions and whatnot. We can't use it in hoists or in elevators or escalators. That should make sense. So 620 deals with elevators and all that. So obviously that's out. Number 9, embedded in poured cement, concrete, or aggregate. Okay, kind of like cement, and then of course aggregate would be that with large stones and rocks and pebbles and all this type of stuff. So not for anything like that. Obviously, that's not what we're going to be using it for. Okay, so again, that's for NM and NMC for that application. All right, embedded in it. All right, number 10, in hazardous classified locations, again, except or specifically permitted by other articles in the code. Okay, so if you're dealing in hazardous locations. So hazardous locations, Article 500, then you have type 1, and you have type in 501, you have type 2 in 502, and you have type 3 in 503. If any application within there of 501, 502, 503 permits you to use a non-metallic sheath cable, then that would be okay. But it has to give specific permission, okay, in those specific articles, right? And if it doesn't, then right here, it's going to say, hey, no dice. You're not going to use it in those locations. Makes sense, but because you know what happens in these areas, hazardous classified areas, we have a lot of times we have seal loss. We're worried about gases migrating through the cable assembly. And again, it's pretty much hollow in there except for the conductors. There's a lot of open space. We wouldn't want gases transmitting from point A to point B. All of that stuff just makes sense, right? So again, unless there's an application where it permits you, let's say maybe you have an area that is a classified location. Maybe it is a, I don't know, let's say maybe it's a aircraft hangar where the aircraft area is a hazardous classified location, but then it has a separation to a waiting area that has a ventilation, maybe a positive break wall that keeps the separation. Well, maybe that area is just wired with, maybe it's non-classified. And then maybe it'll tell you in there that I could use any Chapter 3 wiring method in that area that is unclassified. I just can't in the area that's classified. So again, you could get multiple ratings within a single building, and they may permit it in certain areas of the building. Okay, so just got to be aware of that. I think most people's probably not going to use non-metallic sheath cable in those applications anyway. You're probably using it more in residential and things like that. But again, you do need to know it is available and there are some potential options for you, especially if it's a time and money job. And I'm just going to say it, non-metallic sheath cable is a cheaper alternative. Copper's still copper. Conductors are still conductors. Current's going to flow. It's going to work. But we have to be careful with the volatility of the wiring method depending on where we place it. Make sense? All right. Now let's get into, so that was in general. So now let's get into some specific uses not permitted for NM. Very specific here. All right, so type NM cable shall not be used under the following conditions or in the following locations. So none of the locations that'll be talked about here, and it's not going to be in any of the locations that's talked about here. All right. Well, what's the first one? Makes sense. NM cable is where it cannot be used where exposed to corrosive fumes or vapors. Well, as we saw earlier, it couldn't be in battery storage rooms anyway. It couldn't be like in the elevators or in the shafts or the pits. Again, sometimes you have hydraulic fuel, you have other types of. Look, if there's corrosive fumes or vapors present, you're just not going to use non-metallic sheath cable, right? Makes sense. Number two, where embedded in masonry, concrete, adobe, fill, or plaster. You're just not going to put NM cable in it. It's not permitted to do it. Number three, in a shallow chase of masonry, concrete, or adobe and covered with plaster, adobe, or similar finish. Okay, again, remember, not used. So it might be very convenient for you if you're doing a building and you chip out the masonry and you just want to use NMB because that's what you're using for all the interior walls, but maybe the exterior wall is concrete or brick, interior you were framing up everything and you're like, oh man, I don't want to go through this crap. I'm just going to go down the wall, I'll chip me a groove, and I'm going to lay that NM in there and I'm going to cover it with plaster, adobe, or whatever, anything. No, you're not going to do that. Specifically tells you can't right here. Okay, so what are you going to use? You're going to use probably UFB for that application. All right. Now, next is pretty straightforward here. Okay, NM cable is not to be used in a wet or a damp location. So if it's determined to be, and we have good news, folks, good news here. If you say, well, what constitutes a wet or damp location? Well, you all know, right? Where do you go? Article 100 gives the definition of a dry, a wet, and a damp location. So they're pretty descriptive. They kind of give you some examples as well. So you really have to look at the location. Okay. Like I said, I don't consider the majority of the crawl spaces out there to be a damp or even a wet location. Okay. People say, well, you could have some dew come in or something get in there. I'm like, really? I mean, come on. But again, AHJ could say otherwise, and I'm not here. I'm just here to tell you NM cable can't be in a wet or damp location. Determining what the location is, it's going to be up to the National Electrical Code in Article 100 and your local AHJ. All right, let's move on. So we established something earlier, didn't we? We established that non-metallic sheath cable could be what? Exposed or concealed. Remember? Another big one that people talk about all the time. They're like, oh, well, you can't run that NMB exposed. All right? Well, you can, but there's some caveats and we have to look at it. And we'll kind of got to use our discretion in this discussion. So let's look at it now. So here is 334.15, and this is specifically talking about the exposed work. This is exposing the non-metallic sheath cable, running it along the wall, okay, things like that. We're going to be talking about running it in the basement. We're going to be talking about running it in the crawl spaces, how you run it, okay? So exposed work, it says in exposed work, except as provided in 300.11b, and that is above suspended ceilings and things like that, that's 300.11. It says cable shall be installed as specified in 334.15a through C. Okay, so we got three of them to look at here, A, B, and C. All right, here's what A says. All right, so non-metallic sheath cable, okay, has to be, it says, cables shall closely follow the surface of the building finish or of running boards. Okay, so what they don't want is you stringing out non-metallic sheath cable out at the expand, as it runs out away from the building. It needs to run along the surface. If it's going to run out and not be on the surface, then it needs to what? It needs to be on a running board to support it, okay, and to protect it. Now, we're also going to see a little later with things like attics and whatnot for protection. But here, just remember, the golden rule is run the NM cable with the building. Run it through framing members. If you're going to span it away from frame members, be very careful. You're going to need to run running boards, okay, to do that. Now, follow the surface if you can. Now, B, protection from physical damage. All right, let's talk about this for a second. There is no definition in the National Electrical Code for physical damage. Don't go looking. You're not going to find it. And you're not going to see one in there for severe physical damage, which is used in the NEC, and physical damage is used in the NEC. When this was presented to the code making panels, code making panel 6, I believe, they could not come to an agreement. It's kind of like us in code panel 5. We could not come to an agreement what objectionable current was, because there were some situations where you have to have some type of objectionable current. You can't get rid of it. Just the nature of what the code allows, right? But we tried to define it, and it just didn't go anywhere. And you used to have some of the greatest minds on code making panel 5, okay? Shout out to my code panel 5 members, all right? But we could not come to the determination. Well, they could not come to the determination of what physical damage is, even though we might think in our mind what we know it is. And if you think you got a great definition for physical damage, guess what? You have until June to submit a public input for the 2026 edition of the National Electrical Code. Get off your butt, put it in, okay? It's easy to complain about the code until you put the pen to paper, or in this case, electronically submit a public input, and maybe you can substantiate it, and maybe you can get the code changed, okay? And then you're like, hey, I got the code changed, okay? All right, anyway. All right, so let's go here and look here. So, all right, physical damage. Cable shall be protected from physical damage where necessary by rigid metal conduit. That's acceptable to protect it. So here you see we can put NM cable in a raceway. People question that, but perfectly fine to do so. Intermediate metal conduit, IMC, and this is typically referred to rigid metal as thick wall and intermediate metal is thin wall, okay, or thinner wall, I guess. And then you have electrical metallic tubing. Now that just got added last cycle because before it was never able to provide physical damage protection, but now it can. Schedule 80 PVC conduit. Not Schedule 40, Schedule 80. That can be used, and it's thicker, okay? And uses the same size fittings as the 40, but it's thicker, so the interior space is less for an 80 than it would be the 40 because it's a thicker wall. But it does add that physical protection, okay? So if you think it's going to be, if it's AHJ, or it looks like it's obviously somewhere where it can be subject to physical damage, then the best choice probably here is just sleeve it in Schedule 80 PVC, and that's going to protect it. Now, you also get to use RTRC. This is like a resin thermoset type of compound, like a fiberglass-ish type of thing. Never worked with it myself, but if you have RTRC marked with the suffix XW on it, so it's got to have XW marked on it, then that is adequate to protect from physical damage, okay? It's also in there, okay? And I've got some comments in the chat. I'm going to catch up with you now in a second, so I'm going to get you folks in a second. And then, of course, the last one here is other approved means. What do you think that means? Basically, when you see other approved means, that means if the AHJ wants you to put it in a toilet paper wrapper, then if it's okay to them, then it's okay. Because when it says other approved means, it's whatever is acceptable to the AHJ. Trust me, they're not going to let you use a toilet paper roll. But there are other products out on the market that could protect it, right? Okay, so, be aware of that you can buy other types of products that will sleeve over it. Maybe it's just like a cover that goes over it. I'm sure you folks have seen the utility poles that have that U-shaped protective thing that runs all the way up the pole. Okay, well, they probably make protectors. That would be something that you would present to the AHJ, and they say, okay, look, that's equivalent. I'm okay with that. That's another approved means, and they would use it, okay? Now, that's that part. So who determines subject to physical damage? You really have to look at the location. Now, when I was a head of jurisdictions back in Virginia, one of the things that I used to threshold that I used to do this, and if you're an inspector out there, maybe this will help you, is if the NM cable was being run against the wall and it was behind another appliance or something had to be damaged before you would get to it, then I would consider it not subject to physical damage. Now, we're not talking about Schwartzy getting a sledgehammer and going after all this NMB with a sledgehammer, because anything is subject to physical damage at that point, right? But you've got to use a little common sense. And so if the NM cable is run in a way, like, for example, people take NM cable down to a water heater. And they're like, well, it comes down to the water heater, then comes over the water heater, and they're like, well, that's subject to physical damage. All right, and it's supposed to run with the building surface, you remember? But then it comes over and it comes down to the water heater. It's usually close to the wall. We don't give anybody any real slack over that, or any fit, I should say, fit. But the sheer thing is that you would have to damage that water heater, okay? You would have to damage the water heater in order to damage the NM cable. So in a sense, the footprint of the water heater is greater than the NM cable. So I would judge it not subject to physical damage, and I would allow you to use it. Just remember, every AHJ can look at it different, and opinions, everybody's entitled to one, and everybody's got one. Today, in the woke society that we live in today, everybody's got an opinion. So there you go. All right, now, next, where the NM cable passes through a floor. Okay, so if it's penetrating through the floor, like you're coming up through the floor into, let's say, a cabinet or something like that, that penetration. Now, how many of you do this? It says, we're passing through a floor. The cable shall be enclosed in rigid metal conduit, intermediate metal conduit, electrical metallic tubing, Schedule 80 PVC, wink, wink, wink. I'm using Schedule 80 PVC in this situation, by the way, or RTRC with the suffix XW, or other approved means extending at least 6 inches above the floor. So basically, as it penetrates through the floor, okay, then you want to make sure that the raceway extends up 6 inches so it fully carries it up into whatever you're going past the floor. Now, don't confuse this, folks, okay? Don't confuse this with coming up through the floor into a wall cavity. Not required here. This is penetrating the floor, okay? Not the bottom plate, okay? Just saying. Be aware of that. All right, so this is what we're seeing right here. I just read it to you. Right here, we're passing through the floor. The cable shall be enclosed in rigid metal, intermediate metal, EMT, Schedule 80 or RTRC with the XF suffix or other approved means, and it has to extend at least 6 inches above the floor. So that is as if you're popping through the floor. A good example of this would be an island. If you're running it out to an island and you're popping up through the floor in the bottom of the island, then you want to make sure that you extend it up 6 inches of the protective raceway. In this case, I would use Schedule 80 PVC, by the way. Okay. All right, next. Now, you see this is in yellow. Notice what it says here. It says, conduit or tubing shall be provided with a bushing or adapter that provides protection from abrasion at the point the cable enters and exits the raceway. So, in the past, what people would typically do was take a piece of Schedule 80, cut it off, hopefully deburr it, put it in, and that's it. Now it's required to do what? you're required to put a fitting with a bushing on it, or you could put a bell adapter on it, or they do make these adapters that are designed to go over the end that just for abrasion. Okay, they're like a little sleeve. Okay, whatever, you have to put that so that you don't have those sharp edges. Now, if you've never been cut by PVC and you think that you can only get a cut from rigid, intermediate, EMT, then you ain't been doing it long enough, because I can tell you what, sharp edges of PVC will cut you just as quick. Okay, that type of thing. So keep that in mind. All right. All right, so let's keep on going. So next, this is specific to NMC. It says type NMC cable installed in shallow chases or grooves in masonry, concrete, or adobe. Remember, we can't do that with NM, but we can with NMC. It says it shall be protected in accordance with the requirements of 300.4F and covered with plaster, adobe, or similar. Now, again, 300.4F, again, talks about those shallow grooves, and that's what talks about that 1/16 of an inch steel plate that has to be installed to protect it in the entire groove. Okay. Now, there is an exception to that where you would do this 1/16, but again, that's when you use steel plates, sleeves, or equivalent shall not be required to protect it if you happen to be putting it in rigid, intermediate, rigid PVC, RTRC, or electrical metallic tubing. But in our case, we weren't. We were putting NMC in the wall, in that brick or whatever, masonry, and we were putting plaster or whatever in covering that, okay? So that was different, okay? In this case, we weren't. We were just simply taking the NMC and putting it right in the shallow chase or the shallow groove, right? That type of thing, okay? Let's see here, just a shout out real quick. Clarence Everline, listening and watching from Georgia. Thank you, my friend. Thank you for joining us for this episode. We've got some other stuff here. Joseph says, good hand on the NEMA. Yes, definitely check out the NEMA Evaluating Water Damage document. Again, it was compiled by many manufacturers, so make sure you grab a copy of that. Okay. Let's see here. What do we got here? Clarence says, thank you, because I have used cable trays in commercial settings, but was not sure about residential. Really big multi-million-dollar homes have used cable trays. I'm not going to say that I've never done it. We used a type of cable tray in a large residential, but here's the thing. That wasn't actual cable tray. That was a supporting system. They got around some of the rules by naming it something else. I think Caddy makes it. So it wasn't technically a cable tray. So it was more of a supporting system. And and that's all cable trays are anyway, a supporting system. But this was made by Caddy, and it wasn't actually designed to be a cable tray. It was very unique to them. Caddy makes it. But you can put NM cable in there that doesn't have a CT use because it's not listed as cable tray. So if you know the ins and outs, you can get around some things, okay? But we did put a cable tray one time in a residential application, and we had some issues, so we ended up finding that Caddy product, and that made it easier for us. We didn't have that stuff to mess with. All right, so anyway, let's move on. Now, next is unfinished basements and crawl spaces. Hang with me, folks. I know this is going to be a long one, but again, NM cable can be a long one, so just hang in with me. All right, in unfinished basements and crawl spaces, remember what I said earlier? What does it say about that? Now, it says, where cable is run at angles with joists in unfinished basements and crawl spaces. Now, when we're saying angles, what he means is, it's not running parallel with the framing member. It's running perpendicular to the framing member, or it's running at an angle across the framing like the bottom of the joists, okay? So it's running from joist to joist to joist to joist. Not through bored holes is what we would prefer you to do, but they're running it across the bottom of joists, all right? Let me tell you right off, you're not doing that in crawl spaces and unfinished basements when you're dealing with 14 gauge, 14-2, 12-2, 10-2. You're not going to be doing it. I know some people do it, but you're not supposed to do it. And let me show you why. So it says, where you run at angles across those joists unfinished basements and crawl spaces, it's permitted to secure cables not smaller than 2 6 or 3 8 conductors directly to the lower edge of the joist. Okay, so it has to be no smaller than 2 6s. So a 6-2 with ground could be done to the bottom of the joist. Let's see here. An 8-3 with ground could be secured to the bottom of the joist. That would be okay, right? But again, it's not going to be something you're going to be able to do for 10 gauges, 12 gauges, 14 gauges. And that's what everybody's looping things under the house or under the crawl. That's what they tend to do. If you do that, you need to run running boards and run them on the running board. Okay. You can't just connect them to the bottom of the lower joist. Okay. Now, let's read more about what this says here. So, it's permitted to secure cables not smaller than 2 6s or 3 8s. So just look at your cable. It's got 2 6s in it, you're good. It's got 3 8s in it, you're good. Okay, directly to the lower edges of the joist. Smaller cables shall be run either through bored holes, preferred, in joists, or on running boards. So if you want to run a running board, 1/2-inch ply board, you want to run that down and you want to start running them on that, it's basically running with the surface of the building, then you're okay, right? Not going to be an issue. But you're not supposed to secure them to the bottom of the joist. And I see this all the time. It says it right here that you can't do it. Now, again, non-metallic sheath cable installed on the wall of an unfinished basement. Okay, so we're talking about an unfinished basement. You're just running it. The basement's done and you're running it on the wall. Okay, not inside the framing members, but on the wall. It said installed on the wall of an unfinished basement, okay, shall be permitted to be installed in listed conduit or tubing, or shall be protected in accordance with 300.4. Okay, so you're either going to put it in tubing or you're going to put it in a conduit as it comes down the wall. All right, now, conduit or tubing shall be provided. Now, if you choose conduit or tubing, it shall be provided with a bushing or adapter. Again, they make these little plastic adapters that go on to the end of the tubing or raceway that protects the ends. Those are okay because that would be an adapter. But usually when people don't have that, they just put a connector on the end of it and put a bushing on the end of the connector. Okay. All right. So if you do that, a bushing of that adapter provides protection from abrasion at the point the cable enters and exits the raceway. Now, check me out here. If you're going into a basement, unfinished basement, and you're putting a box on the wall, okay, cinder block wall, right? And you're going to come down and you're wiring everything in non-metallic sheath cable. You put the box, you come up with the raceway, you put the bushing on the end, connector and a bushing or one of those adapters. And now you come into that cable, into that raceway with that cable, all the way down and you come into the box, okay? You won't need a bushing in the box, okay? But you do need one at the other end. Now, if you're just sleeving it down, right, and you're just using it for protection, so then you have a cable entering and leaving, then I'm going to have bushings at both ends or adapters at both ends to protect it from abrasion, okay? Then, also, it goes on to say, the sheathing of the non-metallic sheath cable shall extend through the conduit or tubing and into the outlet device or junction box not less than 1/4 of an inch. So that sheathing has to penetrate into the box from that raceway that connects to it at least 1/4 of an inch. Now, here's another question people ask me, okay? And I'll bring it back up here so you can see it. This is what I've got highlighted. That sheathing of that non-metallic sheath cable has to extend through that conduit tubing down into the outlet or device box or junction box, and at least 1/4 of an inch of sheathing has to penetrate in. So what do people always ask me? What if I have 1 inch of sheathing? That's okay. What if I have 2 inches of sheathing? That's okay. Kind of sloppy, right? But it's okay. I just have to have at least 1/4 of an inch in there, okay? And also, I should mention that the general rule is that you connect cables to boxes. However, there is an allowance. Obviously, if you're going to run it through a raceway into a box, you don't have to connect it at the box. okay, if you're running it in through a raceway. Why? Because there's really no chance for abrasion there anyway. It's running through the raceway, actually into the box. The abrasion issue is at the other end where it enters the top of the raceway, okay? Also, I don't have to secure that non-metallic sheath cable to the box, which you're going to see the code generally requires that to be done in 314. But I don't have to do that if I'm running it into a box through a raceway. What would be the point of securing it to the box? It's not, okay? So that only applies if you're running it through a raceway into the box. Now, it says the cable shall be secured within 12 inches of the point where the cable enters the conduit or tubing, okay? So if you have a box on the wall, you have a conduit coming up, you have your adapter at the top or connector with a bushing at the top, the cable NMB enters the top of that, then I have to make sure I secure it within 12 inches, okay? Within 12 inches of it, all right? Makes sense? All right. Also, it says, again, it has to, at the point where the cable enters the conduit or tubing, metal conduit, tubing, or metal outlet boxes shall be connected to an equipment grounding conductor complying with 250.83 and 250.148, okay? So everything has to be bonded. So you're going to have an equipment grounding conductor coming in, right? That equipment grounding conductor is going to bond the metal box, right? That metal box is going to be connected to what? The metal outlet box is going to be connected to the metal conduit. You have to make sure everything's made up, and that's going to bond everything together. That should take care of itself. But what we don't want you to do, folks, what we don't want you to do, and people do this, is they'll come down the raceway with the non-metallic sheath cable, come out of the box, strip off the sheathing, take the black and the white and the equipment ground, and take it right to the device. Okay? Now, if it's a self-grounding device, and you got the right type of cover, and you make the right connection that's covered in 314, then that connection could bond the box, okay, for receptacles, and that might be okay. And that's what it's alluding to in 250.86 and 250.148. The key takeaway here is you have to ensure is if it's a self-grounding receptacle or whatever you're doing, you need to make sure that raceway is connected to the box, metal box, and all that is connected to the equipment grounding conductors. All has to be connected together. In case that raceway gets energized, we need to clear an overcurrent device. We don't want it to be floating out there isolated, right? Just because we got a cable with an equipment ground coming down, let's not forget about these metal pieces that are encasing conductors that are energized. That needs to be bonded too. So that's a real high level of our grounding and bonding course, but you want to make sure that you're meeting that requirement as well. And let's see if there's any illustration, a picture. No pictures. So, okay. All right, next. 334.17. Through or parallel to framing members, okay? So it says type NM cable and NMC cable shall be protected in accordance with 300.4 or installed through or parallel to framing members. Okay, we could go look at that, and I actually have some, could show you some illustrations of that, but I think we all know what we're talking about in 300.4, right? If I've got a bored hole, I need to make sure that from the edge of that bored hole to the edge of the framing member is at least 1.25 inches, not 1 inch. If it's 1 inch, then I got to do what? I got to put a nail plate on it, 1/16-inch nail plate, protect it from nails or screws, okay? So you want to make sure your bored holes are in the middle of the framing member. Make sense? Now, people ask me this question all the time. Paul, what if I have a wall and I have an open cavity behind it, say under a stairs or something like that? It's just a sealed off cavity. What if I go behind that and I don't bore any holes at all? Then you don't have any problem. It's okay. As long as it's still secured and supported every 4.5 feet, and we'll see that in a minute, then you're okay. However, if I have a building that has siding and I have framing members and I'm boring holes through framing members, it's not a void on the other side, but there's actually the potential for somebody to drive a screw from the outside in, like the siding or the plyboard or whatnot, then it makes a difference. When I bore that hole, both sides of that stud come into play. Okay? So I have to make sure that if it's in a wall that's got the potential to be damaged from both sides, then I have to make sure that I have what? At least 1.25 inches from the edge of the board hole to the edge of the framing member. Now, let's use some common sense here. If I'm putting a wood framing member against a cinder block wall, then I'm going to pay more attention to the board hole towards the area where it could have gypsum board screwed in and stuff than I am on the side that has what? The side that has cement block. Okay? That should be common sense. However, we have seen AHJs who will say, I don't care whether it's cinder block or not. The way the code is written, it'll say that it needs to be no closer than 1.25 inches from the edge of the board hole. It doesn't say in there only one side of that. It actually talks about both sides of the framing member. And in fact, that was a change to make it clearer in the 2023 edition. So I will show you that just so you get it. And again, I'm saying use common sense. Obviously, it's cinder block on the other side. But you know what? There are code purists out there that'll say, nope, code says what it says. All right, well, I will show you right here. See this grayed out? I'm going to take you here, folks. See this right here where it says edges? I'm in 300.4, which we were just talking about. Right here. It says, now I'm going to read it to you and tell me what you think. It says, in both exposed and concealed locations where a cable or raceway type wiring method is installed through board holes in joists, rafters, or wood members, holes shall be bored so that the edge of the hole is not less than 1.25 from the edges of the wood member. Folks, if I want to be literal here, and I know I get those naysayers and those nasty wits that want to post stuff, if you get an inspector who purely reads that and doesn't want to put any common sense into it, and it can happen, then you better be very careful how you bore that hole. Because it says the edges of the wood members. There's 2 edges to the bored hole. Actually, there's 4 edges. The short dimension and long dimension, all edges. But what we're talking about is the edge from the edge of the bored hole horizontally out to the edge of the framing member. That has to be at least 1.25 inches. Now, the way I read this, from the edges, it applies to both sides of that framing member. Again, I don't think that's any big deal if we're running something and there's a cavity behind it because there's no bored hole at all. You're just running it behind the framing member. As long as you're securing and supporting it, it's just running around the stud, that void behind the wall that's nothing's going to be in there. Then I don't see where there's a problem because the bored hole issue doesn't come into play. The moment that you bore a hole, then this rule could come into play. And again, it's going to be how the AHJ interprets that. But if you read it literally, that's a change. You notice how it says edges? They didn't just change this to add the S or add edges for no reason, folks. I'm just saying. It's just my opinion. I say be careful and pay attention to both edges. Okay? Don't want to have anything cause you any potential problem. I'm just saying, keep it simple, stupid. All right. So as you can see here, and I did show you, but I'm going to go back real quick because I don't think I was on that screen. I sometimes forget. Right here, you see it says edges. See it's kind of shaded. It says the edge of the hole is not less than 1.25 inches from the edges of the wood member. 2 edges. Okay. All right. Just saying. That's how the code reads. And I can tell you a way to get around that. If you had an inspector who said that you had a wall, a framed wall, a wood stud wall, and it was against cinder block, okay, and there's a little gap back there maybe, then you running it back there in the gap, as long as you're still securing it within 4.5, then you're running it back that way, then there is no board hole. So there is no question about that. Okay, I'm just saying. There's many ways to skin a cat. Is that a good saying? Can you say that anymore? Skin a cat? Okay. Anyway. All right. So that's what we got there. Just be careful of that. And it also applies when you're running parallel with the framing members, right? That's what we were talking about. So parallel with the framing member means that if I'm running it with the framing member, like the joists, or running it up with the side of the 2x4, and I'm not going through a bored hole, then I still have to maintain what? 1.25 inches from the edge. That's why they use those stackers, right? Trying to keep the cables in the center of the framing member, or at least 1.25 inches away from the edge. So for bored holes, you got to be careful. For parallel with framing members, like running them along joists or running parallel with the framing member, make sure you install them in the center so that they're not near 1.25 inches from the edge. Okay, and that one has nothing to do with bored holes, by the way. Okay, so keep that in mind. All right, 334.19, cable entries. The sheathing of non-metallic sheath cable shall extend not less than 1/4 inch beyond any cable clamp or cable entry. So what we mean here is you might have a clamp to a box, and let me go on and kind of give you an illustration here. Let's jump over here. Okay, so what you see here on the screen right here is a cable clamp. Okay, so the sheathing has to extend beyond the clamping mechanism into the box at least 1/4 inch, right? But what if it's one of these boxes that has no clamp? It's just a knockout. Then you have to still extend it in at least 1/4 inch. Okay, makes sense? All right, so that's what it says right here in 334.19. Can I have 1 inch? Can I have 1.5 inches? Absolutely you can. Again, it gets to where the borderline's sloppy, but again, workmanship is in the eye of the beholder, right? So that type of thing. So you do you, but you need at least 1/4 inch, okay? All right, next, 334.23, accessible attics. Says the installation of cable in accessible attics or roof spaces, and again, the key here is accessible attics, whether it's through a scuttle hole or through a set of pull-down stairs that are permanent, or just something where you just take a ladder that's portable and you pop the hole open and get up in the attic, okay? Then the installation of the cable has to comply with 320.23. Now, of course, 320, folks, is AC cable. But rather than be redundant and regurgitate it, the code sends you there, does the same thing for MC cable. It sends you there for MC cable as well, sends you there for non-metallic sheath cable. And of course, that's where all the rules are found in 320.23. So we'll go look at those. We'll click on it. So even though this may say type AC cable in this space, because it was referenced here by 334, just forget that it says AC. This is going to apply to NM cable as well. And it says the AC cable, in our case, the NM cable, in accessible attics or roof spaces shall be installed as specified in 320.23 A and B. All right, so let's look at A. Cables run across the top of floor joists and framing members. So running across, you go up into the attic, you come above into the attic, and it's say you have pull down stairs, or maybe you have a portable ladder, and you go and you poke open the little access scuttle hole, right? That's what I have in my house. I have a little scuttle hole, all right? And my ceiling's like 18 feet, so I have to use this massive ladder just to get into my scuttle hole. Okay, so it says, we'll run across the top of framing members, again, running through the attic, and how many guys have seen that all the time, running all over the attic? It says, we're running across the top of framing members or across the face of rafters or studding that is within 7 feet of the floor, okay, so up 7 feet, or horizontal space out 7 feet. The cable shall be protected by guard strips that are at least as high as the cable, okay? So if I'm within 7 feet, what am I going to do? In this case, I'm going to have, so this is normal access. I'm going to make sure that I put 2x4s maybe, and I'm going to run the anim cable beside the 2x4. That's the protective guard strip. So if you step on the 2x4, you're not going to step on the cable. That's the whole thing. A lot of jurisdictions will make you sandwich it so that there's a 2x4 or so on either side of the cable, so that when somebody's stepping around that access hole, right, that they can't step onto or damage the non-metallic sheath cable. And it goes out what? Horizontal 7 feet and goes up 7 feet, okay? Now, it goes on to say the cable shall be protected by those guard strips, and they have to be at least as high as the cable. Well, obviously a 2x4 is fine. It's thicker, right? It's not exactly a 2x4 anymore, but it's going to be adequate. They do make guard strips, but most people just run 2x4 protective strips right beside the cable in that area. Now, check this out. It says, where this space is not accessible by permanent installed stairs or ladder, i.e. scuttle hole, portable ladders, okay? Then it says, protection shall only be required within 6 feet of the nearest edge of the scuttle hole or attic entrance, okay? So, access by permanent steps, pull down steps, 7 feet. Think of this as an all-encompass umbrella, if you will, of space. 7 feet out and up, just a big old space, okay? But if it's a scuttle hole, then it's reduced down to 6 feet, okay? Now, when I'm asked about this, people say to me, they'll say, Paul, well, what about the other areas of the attic? Well, if they're outside of this area, then they're okay to be run and they would not need the extra protective strips on that. This is only for the area within that area, okay? So be careful with that. Now, what I will tell you is that most jurisdictions will look at the attic. And if the attic is designed to support weight and you've got all this non-metallic sheath cable running all everywhere up there, then they may want you to put it down parallel with the framing members to get it below the framing line or below the joist line, or I guess it would be this second, the floor below it, those would be the joists. And I guess up in the attic, those would still be joists, okay? Anyway, if you're going to do that, if it can bear weight and it's a finished off area, then that can change things, and you might want to run it down parallel with the framing members because then the protective strips are just going to make it difficult for that application. But just remember, if it's pull down steps, 7 feet out, 7 feet up, just think of an umbrella there, this space. All right, 7 feet out in all directions. Woo, like that. If it is a scuttle hole, 6 feet in all directions, you have to protect it, okay? Now, what about once you're up in the attic and you're talking about cables installed parallel to framing members? Okay, now parallel means it's running with the framing member, on the right beside the framing member, okay? Well, it says where a cable is installed parallel to the sides of rafters, so you're running it up the rafter, let's say, to get to that light that's in there for when you're accessing the attic area or whatnot. So you're running it up the side of the rafter. Okay, it says where cable is installed parallel to the sides of rafters, studs, or ceiling or floor joists, neither guard strips nor running boards shall be required, and the installation shall comply with 300.4D. So basically, if you're going to run it down in the floor or in the middle of the rafters, you still have to maintain that 1.25 inches. Keep that in mind. So even if you're going to run them into the joists, okay, that you're running through the floor joists or whatnot, you want to make sure that you keep them 1.25 inches from it. Okay, because if you're less than 1.25 inches, then you're going to follow the rules in 300.4D, and you're going to have to put guard strips. Who wants to do that? So keep it 1.25 inches away. Okay. All right. Next thing is 334.24 bending radius. All right. So how much can you bend a non-metallic sheath cable? People say that stuff is so flexible, we just bend. Okay, well, you can bend it to the point that you elongate the conductors inside of it. You will damage the exterior portion of the bend on the cable, and then in the middle part of the bend, if you bend it too tight, you cause it to what we call caterpillar, and that causes the insulation to bunch up. So you're really affecting the conductors that are inside of the cable, not so much the sheathing and all that type of the cable. It's what's inside of it that's going to be affected. So here's what it says. Bends in type NM and NMC cable shall be so made that the cable will not be damaged. So that's the first rule. You bend it, do some visuals. With MC cable, for example, we have our bending rules. If you bend it too tightly, guess what happens? It busts out the convolutions on the back. If it's interlocked, it'll actually cause them to separate. That's damage. There is no repair for that, folks. You can't go find an MC cable repair kit, all right? Once you break that convolution, you're either going to replace it or you're going to put a junction box in. We as a manufacturer, the manufacturers will not give you any repair procedure for damaged MC cable armor. They're not. They'll tell you to replace it. So be careful. Now, when it comes to non-metallic sheath cable, okay, it's non-metallic. It should have a little give to it, right? But you can't bend it to the point where it's going to look damaged. And it says the radius of the curve of the inner edge of the bend during or after the installation shall not be less than 5 times the diameter of the cable. Okay? Now, where do you get this diameter value? The manufacturers will give it to you. I'm sure none of you are going to be walking around with a caliper making these measurements. Nobody does that. But if you go to every manufacturer's website, you will see that they will give you the diameters. They'll give you the wide dimension or the long dimension and the short dimension, which is turned on the side. That's for the elliptical cable. For the round cable, they'll give you that value as well. They'll have all those values of the diameter will all be listed on the product sheets from every manufacturer. So it's so easy. Every manufacturer lists it. But here's some advice. Make everything nice and rounded and swoop. Even things that are kind of right angle, it's really hard if you take the dimension, and we're going to look at, this is a change for this code cycle, and I think this was by Ryan Jackson might have submitted this, because he brought up the case where it didn't say which dimension do you use, the long dimension or the short dimension, which one do you use? So it's now been clarified. But the point is, when you're going to those boxes, I've seen people who take it and come under the box and come back up into the box. And at the bottom, to be neat, they make the cables really tight. So that loop at the bottom is really tight bend. Chances are that's going to be what? Tighter than 5 times the diameter. And that means it's going to be stressing out. You have to at least maintain 5 times the diameter. Okay? So you go to the manufacturer. You find out what the diameter is, and I'll show you which one we use here in a second. And you simply multiply that by 5, and now you have to make sure that the radius, okay, and that's from the center arc out, kind of thinking about bending it around a baseball or something like that, or a soda can. That's your radius, okay? And radius is the center out like a ball. The center out is the radius, okay? Circumference is all the way around. Diameter is all the way across, right? So we're talking about center out, kind of the pivot. It's like wrapping it around the ball. Make it nice and smooth, okay? Now, which dimension do you use? All right, so this is what is new for 2023. Right here, it says for flat cables, and that's elliptical, like 12-2, 10-2. They even make 14 with the 14.3 now that's totally flat, like elliptical, instead of just the round plexed version. They make that in 12 the same way now. People are starting to use these flat NMBs, and we're not talking about just the flat ones like we've always used, 14.2, 12.2, 10.2. Those are called elliptical cables. But now they're making 14.3 that are also flat like that. So what dimension do you use? Okay. In order to multiply by the 5 times, it says for flat cables, it says the major diameter dimension of the cable shall be used to determine the bending radius. So on a flat cable, you have 2 dimensions. You have the flat dimension, and then you have the short edges, okay? And so the major diameter is the bigger diameter. So you're going to use the flat side, not the edges, to do this. And you simply take that value, multiply it by 5, and that is your maintained minimum bending radius that you have to maintain. Just don't bend it really tight. Be nice and smooth in your turns, okay? It's okay to be loopy when it comes to the NM cable, all right? All right, next, getting in now into where people make mistakes. We're talking about securing and supporting, okay? So 334.30, remember .30 in most of your code cable articles dealing with securing and supporting, okay? As well as many of your raceways, it's 30 is dealing with securing and supporting. All right, non-metallic sheath cables shall be supported and secured by staples, cable ties listed and identified for securement, and I think most of them you'd buy at Supply House are going to be anyway, and supports or straps, hangers, or similar fittings designed and installed so as not to damage the cable. Okay. Now, something was brought up in a recent meeting. We had a NEMA meeting, and it was brought up about people wanting to think about, should we start requiring insulated staples? Now, I chimed up and said, I don't think so. I don't think it should matter. An installer should know how to do it right. You know that you don't drive that staple to hammer the NM cable and embed it into the wood. You only have to put the staple in enough to keep the NM cable in the center of the actual framing member. You don't have to drive it home, folks. In fact, you don't even have to drive it. It doesn't even have to touch the NM cable, okay? But, at the end of the day, it's just there to hold it in place. So it was asked, should we put a code proposal in to require insulated staples? Well, it might be a great thing, but again, at the end of the day, if you know how to install a staple, it shouldn't matter whether it's a metal staple or it's a insulated staple. It really shouldn't matter if you know what you're doing. You have enough skill, then it shouldn't be an issue, right? All right, again, we can't fix stupid, but we can, I guess, mitigate it as much as possible. All right, so let's keep going on this now. Now, it does say that we have to support it and secure it at intervals not exceeding 4.5 feet, okay? So AC cable is 4.5 feet. NM cable is 4.5 feet. MC cable is 6 feet, okay, in general, okay? If you're running vertical, then, and you're of a certain size, then you can actually go 10 feet for MC cable in a vertical application. But we're just talking in general, it would be within 6 feet for MC cable. So 4.5 feet. So every 4.5 feet, we're going to secure it and support it, okay? Now, keep in mind that if the NMB or NM cable running through board holes or through framing members or even through metal studs, as long as they got full grommets in there, covers the entire punched hole, can't use those half grommets, full grommets, okay, if you're using metal framing members, metal studs, as long as those studs, and typically they'll be 16 inches on center anyway, but as long as those studs aren't more than 4.5 feet apart, as you run that NM cable through those framing members or board holes, it's considered supported. It's fine, okay? Not going to have to do anything additional for that. All right, it also goes on to say that you have to do what? Every 4.5 feet, and you have to secure it within 12 inches of every cable entry into enclosures, such as outlet boxes, junction boxes, cabinets, or fittings, okay? So that's the first golden rule. Now, we'll look at something a little different here in a second, but that's the first golden rule. So NM cable supported every 4.5 feet, and it's secured within 12 inches of every what? Outlet box, junction box, cabinet, okay? So in doing so, could I secure it at 10 inches? Absolutely. 8 inches? Absolutely. 6 inches? Absolutely. It just has to be within 12 inches, okay? So 12 inches all the way back to 1 inch from the box. As long as you put that securement in there, staple, cable tie, strap, whatever, then you're going to be fine, okay? And then you can go 4.5 feet to the next one, okay? All right, so it says the cable length between cable entry and the closest cable support shall not exceed 18 inches, okay? All right, so let me explain this one, because this is where people people like to do loops. They call them service loops. So they come to a box, and they bring the NM cable in, all right? Now, the strap, the staple, we'll use staple, keep it simple. The staple has to be within 12 inches, right, of the clamp, okay? Well, that amount of actual cable between that staple and that actually point of entry into the box, that amount of cable can't be more than 18 inches. So you can't have these big, massive loops going on, okay? It says from the closest cable support, so let's say we put one at 12 inches from the box, from the cable clamp, I can only have 18 inches of actual cable, and it's measured along the cable, folks. You measure it along the cable. I can't have more than 18 inches there. If you're one of those installers who likes to put the big circle loops there, and it's more than 18 inches, then that's a violation of the code. Okay, you can't have more than 18 inches there. Okay. And then the last one that we tend to see a lot with this is this one right here, is flat cables shall not be stapled on their edge. You know, electricians sometimes get in such a big hurry, stapling. I actually did an inspection here in Texas on a job. It was out in the county, so they knew they didn't have to get any inspections. I literally walked that job, and I could probably count 50 times where they actually stapled the NM cable on its edge. It clearly says you can't do that in the code. You want to know why? Because in a non-metallic sheath cable, you have two insulated conductors, and typically you have a bare conductor. So when those two cables are on top of each other, that's why we do a crush and impact test in UL 719 and UL 2556. If you staple it, it will cause those conductors to crush into the actual bare conductor. Even though it's encased in paper, it doesn't take much to crush this down and cause damage inside of it. Okay? So, regardless of the fact that the code says you can't do it, there's legitimate reasons why you should not staple it on its edge. But people get in a hurry and they start throwing up these things, and sometimes they staple it on the edge, and they rightfully should be called out for that. That is potentially damaging the cable assembly. Now, I know what you're saying. We got arc fault devices. We can detect it. Who the hell wants to try to find that in a wall after the sheetrock's already up? Not me. I don't want to have to explain to the owner why I got to cut your sheetrock. Install it right. Don't install it on its edge. Make sense? Okay. I know y'all all know that, but just want to make sure. All right, now, it says sections of cable protected from physical damage by raceway. Check this out, folks. Shall not be required to be secured within the raceway. We have tons of people that say, wait a minute, how are you going to secure it if it's inside of a raceway? Well, you don't have to. Okay? Obviously, it's not moving anywhere. It's staying in the raceway. And obviously, when it comes into the box, we don't have to worry about abrasion because it's opening straight through a fitting into the box. You just have to make sure that your sheathing extends how much? 1/4 of an inch into the box. We covered that earlier, right? Okay. And I always like to see if there's any images, but they don't. Okay. Next, let's talk about horizontal holes through holes and notches. Okay, so we were talking on, but now we're specifically talking about what happens when we run horizontal through the framing members and things like that. Okay, well, it says, in other than vertical runs, obviously this is horizontal, so it would be other than vertical run. That makes kind of all the sense in the world, right? It says, cables installed in accordance with 300.4 shall be considered to be supported and secured where such supports does not exceed 4.5 feet intervals, and the non-metallic sheet cable is securely fastened in place by an approved means within 12 inches of each box, cabinet, conduit body, or other non-metallic sheath cable termination. What does that mean? Okay, folks. So I got a box. I come up with my NMB up from the box vertically, and now I'm going to turn and go horizontally through my bored holes. So as long as before it goes through that bored hole, as long as it's secured within 12 inches, okay, of that box, now I can continue to run it through those horizontal holes, As long as those bored holes, again, give me at least 1.25 inches from the edge of the framing members. We covered that earlier. That's why it makes a reference back to 300.4. As long as I do that, guess what? Then it's considered supported. And as it's running through those bored holes or running through those punched holes in metal framing members or through notches in those framing members, as long as you have grommets, if it's metal, remember that, then it's considered secured and it's considered supported. I don't have to do anything until I do what? Till I get to the point where I come out of the bored hole, then I have to turn and go vertical down the stud to that box. And then what happens? I have to make sure that I have a securement within what? 12 inches of that box, right? It's fairly simple to think about the concept, right? Now, I want to talk about one application for boxes where you would have to secure it closer than 12 inches, okay? And so that one is going to be an example right here, and let me share that with you. And let me go right here. So see this box right here? So this box right here is a box that requires, because this is a box that is 4 by 2.25, and you do have an allowance for this box that if it doesn't have any clamp on it, notice there's no clamps in this, it's just you knock the holes out and you push the cable in it, then that's required to have securement within 8 inches. So if there was a clamp on this box, then you could go up to 12 inches. But if there's no clamp on this box, and this box is a 2.25 by 4-inch box, just a typical nail-up box with no clamp built into it, just punched out holes, then I have to do what? I will have to secure it within 18 inches, okay? And that's where you're gonna get it right here in 314.17 B2 under the exception. And why is that an exception? Because in 314.17 B2, it says that all cables have to be secured to boxes, except when they run in raceways, of course. Well, if the box, in that exception, it says, oh, but you know what? If it's one of those 2.25 by 4-inch, like a nail-up box with no clamp built into it, just a knockout hole, then guess what? I need you to put a securement on that cable within 8 inches. Now, if that nail-up box happens to have a built-in clamp, and you've seen them, they got this like little V in there that actually secures the cable to the box, then I could go up to 12 inches, okay? But if it's just one of those Carline boxes that you knock the holes out in it and you put the cable in it, then I have to secure that cable within 8 inches, okay? Make sense? All right, so that's what I wanted to show you, again, before we went away from that. Okay, now let's talk about unsupported cables. Yes, I can run non-metallic sheath cable unsupported for certain applications, right? So it says non-metallic sheath cable shall be permitted to be unsupported where the cable, number one, is fished between access points through concealed spaces in finished buildings or structures, and supporting is impracticable. Now, this is not something that you're going to do during construction before your CO, before it's all finished. This is if you maybe made a mistake and now the building finishes up and I have to go in and pop a hole and fish something down the wall. Okay, then I'm going to allow you to fish it down, okay? In a finished building, I need to get that cable there, then I'm going to allow you to do that and you wouldn't need to support it. Now, of course, it's going to be connected to the box, right? But I'm able to actually fish it unsupported down that wall, okay? Or through that concealed space. The second one is, if not more than 4.5 feet from the last point of cable support to the point of connection to a luminaire or other piece of electrical equipment, and the cable and point of connection are within an accessible ceiling in a 1, 2, in a multifamily building. So as long as it's a 1-family, a 2-family, or a multifamily building, okay, and it's an accessible ceiling, like maybe in those cases, you remember you could have a drop ceiling and you could have it above a drop ceiling in a 1, 2, or in a multifamily dwelling unit. Well, then I can have it be like a whip, if you will, and go 4 feet down to a luminaire or another piece of electrical equipment, whatever it may be, okay, then I'm all right to do that under that allowance, okay? Basically, think of it from the last securement staple, I'm allowed to go whip with like a whip 4.5 feet to the luminaire or to other piece of electrical equipment, okay? But it is only within accessible ceilings of 1 family, 2 family, and multifamily, okay, dwellings. All right, next is C. It says wiring devices without separate outlet boxes. All right, check this out. It says, a wiring device identified for use without a separate outlet box and incorporating an internal cable clamp shall be permitted where the cable is secured in place at intervals not exceeding 4.5 feet and within 12 inches from the wiring device wall opening, and there shall be at least a 1/2 inch loop of unbroken cable or 6 inches of cable end available on the interior side of the finished wall to permit replacement. So they have certain devices, there's certain switching devices that are integral devices, okay? The box is integrated with the switching mechanism and that type of thing, okay? So I'm allowed to be able to do that, and that takes the place of being a box. So it's basically a wiring device. I'm trying to think of the name of it. I don't think it's Cheetah, but there are assemblies that the device, like a switch or receptacle, has an integrated box and everything's at one. So I don't need a separate outlet box. It's all integrated in one, if you will. And that's giving you allowance to be able to do that. Other than that, you're still going to secure it and support the cable itself every 4.5 feet. And you're going to make sure it's secured within 12 inches, okay? And you're going to have at least 12 inches of unbroken cable, or you're going to have 6 inches of cable end available on the interior side of the finished wall. That means out of that box, okay? That all integrated wiring device box, okay? You just don't need a separate outlet box for that. Now, 334.40, boxes and fittings. Boxes and insulating material. It says non-metallic outlet boxes shall be permitted as provided in 314.3. So obviously I can use non-metallic outlet boxes with non-metallic sheath cable. That's a no-brainer. Okay, and if we kick 314.3, you'll see it's simply just talking about non-metallic boxes, and it permits, again, it tells you that it can be used. Here it says non-metallic boxes shall be permitted only with open wire insulators, knob and tube. Nobody would do that anymore. But maybe you're doing a replacement or a service call, and that's important to know. If you want to use a non-metallic box with some existing knob and tube, if you encounter it, I would recommend you yank it, but whatever. And then it goes on to also say, and entirely non-metallic sheaths, like a non-metallic sheath cable is where you would use it. So, okay. So we're okay to use. Obviously makes sense. Non-metallic sheath cable, non-metallic box is not a problem. All right, next. B, devices with insulating materials. Okay, again, self-contained switches, self-contained receptacles, and listed non-metallic sheath cable interconnector devices of insulating material that are listed for use without a box shall be permitted to be used without boxes in exposed or concealed installations. Now, I'm sure you've all seen these devices that are designed to splice, and they're used typically for when you have. Let me give you an example where we used to use those. Now, they used to be only used exposed. They couldn't be concealed in the wall, and they were only used typically for repair application, right? Well, that is no longer the case anymore. You can use those in a repair. You can use those in a new installation. I don't have a picture of them, but it's a little device where you bring the NMBs in each side, and some of them have that can take 3 cables, and you open it up, and you terminate them on it, and you snap it closed, and it has supporting loops on it that you're going to mount it to something, and basically you're allowed to put this in the wall, concealed. You all know that junction boxes have to be accessible, but this device is allowed to be concealed. Close it up into the wall. And where did we use these? Many years ago when we used these remember when we had a lot of flooding? I used to work at NEMA, and we used to get calls all the time, like my basement flooded, but it only flooded up 2 feet, 3 feet. Okay. The non-metallic sheath cable that was exposed to the flood has to be ripped out. That's not in question. Go look at the evaluating water guide from NEMA. That's got to come out. If it gets into the ends, it's got to come out. If the sheathing is exposed to flooding water, then you got to rip it out. But what about the ones that go up the wall that's in the ceiling? What if that wasn't flooded? Well, you could remove the non-metallic sheath cable up as far as you can go until the paper is dry. Okay, it's fresh paper. Now you could put these devices on it, leave the wiring in the ceiling, put these devices on it, and now extend it and run new NMB down the lower part that you removed without rewiring everything. So in the past, those were only used for repair. Now you can use them everywhere if you want. Now, they were real big on modular homes. They were real big when you get those manufactured home and you have two pieces and you click them together. But now they can be used, again, concealed, or they can be used exposed if you want. They're perfectly fine. Once they connect together, they don't come apart. You really have to work hard to get them apart, okay? All right. And again, self-contained switches and all that, again, is like the cheetah styles and all that stuff. It's all integrated in its own little handy little package, okay? You buy them that way. All right, next C, it says devices with integral enclosures. Again, wiring devices with integral enclosures identified for such use shall be permitted as provided in 300.15e, okay? So again, that is, if you get a device and it already has an enclosure built into it, that's okay. I don't need any other box, okay? It's permitted to use that. Now 300.15e, I'll click on it so you can see it. That's integral enclosures. It says, oops, let me get back here so you can see it. Well, here's what we got. I want to show you. So we're talking about here devices with integral enclosures. So if the wiring device has an enclosure built into it, kind of similar to what we've been talking about, then that's okay. I don't need any extra separate box for it, whatever. I just bring the non-metallic sheath cable right into it. 300.15e says a wiring device with an integral enclosure identified for the use, having brackets that securely fasten the device to the walls or the ceiling of conventional on-site framing construction for use with non-metallic sheath cables shall be permitted in lieu of a box or conduit body. Again, they make these devices that you can do this, and you don't have to worry about it, okay? You don't need a separate box is what it's trying to say. All right, ampacity. All right, here's the big one. I know we've been doing this for a while. I think we're over 2 hours now. This is a long Master the NEC episode, so hopefully you've stuck with me or you'll watch it in parts. Ampacity, 334.80. It says the ampacity of type NM and NMC cables shall be determined in accordance with 310.14. Okay. Now that's going to give you the guidance for adjustments, corrections. It's going to tell you that ampacities are in 310.16, all those type of things. You get that guidance at 310.14. Now it says the ampacity shall not exceed that of the 60-degree column rated conductors. It doesn't matter, folks, that I told you earlier that it was NMB means that the inner conductors are equivalent to THHN and it has a 90-degree rated insulation, okay? It doesn't matter. It can exceed 60 degree. However, you might run into occasion where you're putting it in thermal insulation, or you might be bundling it together. Then that 90 degrees is going to be beneficial, at least for adjustment and corrective purposes. But at the end of the day, you can't exceed the value of the 60-degree column for that non-metallic sheath cable. Okay, so only reason we're using the 90 is to make sure that we don't have a conductor after the adjustment or correction that may be less than what's in the 60-degree column. That would be a problem, wouldn't it? So that's why we do adjustment and corrections, to make sure the conductor is still good for its application. All right, so it says, so we know that 60 is our threshold. It says the 90-degree rating shall be permitted to be used for ampacity adjustments and corrections. And of course, that's 310.15b1. and 310.15C1. Okay, C1 being for the number of current the conductors that exceed 3, and then of course the current carrying conductors that exceed 3, and we're looking at 310.15B1, and that is for the ambient temperature. Okay, to where this is located. All right, so the 90-degree C rating shall be permitted to be used for ampacity adjustment and correction calculations, provided that the final calculated ampacity does not exceed that of the 60-degree rated conductor. So let me give you an example because people get confused with this. If I have a conductor that's rated 15 amps, and now I'm going to put it in a situation where I have an adjustment or correction, I can use the 90. So this is the 60. I can use the ampacity value up here at the 90. Then I apply those demand factors to it, or those correction and adjustment factors, I should say. Then what happens is the ampacity was up here starts to drop. Once you start multiplying it by whatever the percentage is based on 310.15B1 or 310.15C1, then the ampacity from that 90 starts to drop. Now, if it stops above the value of the 60, that's okay. That means your conductor is still good for whatever the rating is at the 60-degree mark. Okay? All you did was make sure it was still good. But what if I had a situation where the ampacity from the 90 started dropping that conductor's ampacity down below the 60? Then you got a problem because you can't exceed that of the 60. And now you have a conductor that after adjustment and correction, it doesn't even have the same ampacity it would be if it's 60. Then what do you got to do? You got to go to a bigger conductor, and then you do this all over again. Okay? That's the way it works. Okay? So basically, all we're doing is making sure that if we're in an adjustment and correction situation, that I've still got a conductor that is adequate to handle the load. Okay, right? And it doesn't exceed the value that's in a 60-degree column. Remember, easy little tip, folks. Always choose your conductor by going to the 60-degree column first. Then do an adjustment and correction from the 90 and see if your 60-degree selection is still okay. That's how you should really do it. All right? All right, so there we go. Now it says the ampacity of type NM and NMC installed in cable trays shall be determined in accordance with 392.80A. So if you are going to stick non-metallic sheath cable in a cable tray, right here it's saying, guess what? I need you to go up to 392.80A, and there's going to be some rules there when you're trying to find the ampacity for those cables in a cable tray. And it's going to talk about spacing and placement and all this kind of stuff there. But that's giving you directions to go up there if you're putting it in a cable tray. And you remember what I said earlier? You can't put NM cable in a cable tray unless it's evaluated for use in a cable tray and it has a marking on it that says it's for use in a cable tray. Okay? Still a rare application, but could happen. Okay? All right? Next, where more than 2 NM cables, and listen to me here, folks, because my code changes in this one, in these two that I submitted. It says, where more than 2 NM cables contain 2 or more current carrying conductors are installed. And remember, a 14-2 is 2 current carrying conductors, a black and a white. They're both current carrying conductors in that situation, right? It says, so where you have more than 2, so that's 3 or more cables with 2 or more current carrying conductors installed without maintaining spacing between the cables through the same opening in a wood framing member, in a wood framing that is sealed with thermal insulation, caulk, or sealing foam, the ampacity of each conductor shall be adjusted in accordance with table 310.15C1. And again, that's the table that gives you the number of current carrying conductors. Okay? So when you start getting over 4 and up, then you start changing and have a percentage that you're going to drop the ampacity that conductor can handle. Okay? All right. So when we're talking about where does this take place? Atop of your panel, if you bore holes and you're going through a top plate, typically you're required to maintain the rating of that assembly in that wall member. So if you penetrate the top plate or the bottom plate and you use sealing foam, rock wool, foam insulation, that great stuff, orange, then what happens is you have to maintain that rating of that assembly so that you don't have the propagations from smoke and act like a stack effect. So you have to seal it back off. Now that doesn't apply horizontally in this situation. This is a vertical application, up and down through penetrations, right? But it really is anywhere that you would have a penetration that would allow migration or combustibles in 300.20, right? So basically what we want to know is if I bring non-metallic sheath cables through a bored hole and I spray foam in it, and I've got more than 2 of them through that hole, then I'm going to affect the ampacity of that conductor, okay? Now, I won't get into the math, but good news is this. As long as you don't have more than 4 14.2s or 4 12.2s or 1 14.3 and 3 14.2s or 1 12.3 and 3 12.2s or whatnot, as long as you don't have more than 9 current carrying conductors, even after the adjustment that has to take place in 310.15C1, you're still going to have a conductor that can handle the ampacity, whether it's 15 amps or 20 amps. So count, as long as you don't have more than 9 current carrying conductors in 12 gauge, 14 gauge, you're not going to be a problem, okay? The moment you go over that, then you have a problem. And you're going to have to either increase the size of conductors or separate out your cables a little more through more bored holes. Now, what about if you're running them through joists and stuff like that? Well, those you wouldn't seal on the interior of the building, right? So if there's no thermal insulation in it, then you don't have to worry about it in the bored hole, okay? Or in the opening, okay? Wood framing opening, okay? And also that applies whether or not you cut a notch in it or you bore holes. If it's an opening in the wood framing member and you fill it with foam because you need to maintain the rating of that assembly, this could come into effect. So keep that in mind. And it also reminds you that 310.12A2 exceptions shall not apply. Does everybody know what that means? That is that famous 10-foot, 10% rule. That can save your butt on SC cables. That can save your butt on other applications. It will not save your butt on NM cable, okay? So you cannot use the 10-foot, 10% rule, okay? And we're going to cover that in another video at another time where I go over those type of things as we go through this 2023 series. All right? We're almost done. Hang with me now. Next, okay, so you can't use this one right here. Go look it up in your code, 310.14A2. That is a 10-foot, 10% rule. That used to be 310.15A2, I believe, and it got changed in the 2023 edition. All right, now, where more than 2 NM cables containing 2 or more current carrying conductors are installed in contact with thermal insulation without maintaining spacing between cables. Now, this could come into play if you're running them down the wall on an exterior wall where you're re-insulating. This can come into play. So, where you're running what? More than 2 cables with 2 or more current carrying conductors installed in contact with thermal insulation without maintaining spacing between cables, the ampacity of each conductor shall be adjusted in accordance with 310.15C1, and that same allowance for the 10-foot, 10% can't be applied. Okay? It might save your butt in other types of cable assemblies, but it ain't going to save your butt here. You can't use it. Okay? And they really don't have an illustration. I was hoping they had an illustration. Okay? Now, the code change that was my proposal, folks, where this was mine right here. And I wanted it to match what it was up here. It didn't make sense that you couldn't do it. You could do it here, but you couldn't do it here. So we wanted to make sure it was in both of them that limited that. Okay, so that was the code change that we had for that. All right, construction. We go through this really quickly and we'd be done. You're not going to spend a whole lot of time in part 3. You're just going to buy the products. The manufacturers will do the construction. The outer cable sheathing of non-metallic sheath cable shall be non-metallic material. It's typically extruded PVC. 334.104, the conductors. It tells you that the 600-volt insulated power conductors shall be size 14 through 2. So you know that you can only buy non-metallic sheath cable in sizes 14 gauge up to 2 gauge. That's the only range of the product. All right, and that's for copper. It can be 14-2 gauge for aluminum or copper clad aluminum conductors. Okay, so they make NMB. We make it in copper. It's made in copper clad aluminum, and it's obviously, you could use aluminum, but nobody produces 14 gauge, nobody produces, 12 gauge or even 10 gauge aluminum anymore. Isn't that interesting? The code actually allows for a non-metallic sheath cable to have a 12 gauge or even a 10 gauge solid aluminum conductor, because it's not the same aluminum as it was back in the 60s. It's not 1350 type alloy. It's 8000. It's a lot more ductileness, okay? But nobody makes it because the stigmatized issue of the late 60s and early 70s that we had with 1350 aluminum. So nobody wants to try to do it, but you could if you wanted. It's clearly states here that you could do it 12-2 if you wanted, okay? Also, that new PCS, remember I told you that NMPCS with the power and control in there? Y'all are probably more familiar with it in MC cable because I'm a patent holder of that. But it also is available in non-metallic. So control and signal conductors shall be no smaller than 18 gauge copper. So those little conductors that are in there are 18 gauge. Now that is for running it to, say, a luminaire that's being controlled by an automated system, daylight shading or turning it off, but it also has power in the same cable assembly, okay? That's okay. You're not gonna have a problem with crosstalk. There's not gonna really be any issue with that because of the twisting of the signal and control cables. But at the end of the day, those little conductors cannot be smaller than 18 gauge in that construction type. Now remember, these are not the building wire ones. That is these 14-2 or 12-2. These are for those smaller control in a product called NMPCS. Okay, just keep that in mind. All right, 334.108. We're almost there, folks. Equipment grounding conductor. It says in addition to the insulated conductors, the cable shall have an insulated cover or bare equipment grounding conductor. Did you know that? Oh, sorry, I didn't share the code. There you go. Here's the equipment grounding conductor. Did you know that the insulated conductors, that the actual, in addition to those, the blacks, the whites, the reds, in addition to that, the equipment ground, we usually see bare, right? But it could be insulated. And if it was, it would be green or green with the yellow stripe, obviously. But it also is allowed to be bare, okay? And that's not a problem either. But typically, most manufacturers are going to use bare. We're not going to put insulated in there. Why? Because it costs money for additional insulation. It's not necessary. Okay? So, again, this kind of shows you that it can be insulated, covered, or bare. Insulation. It says the insulated power conductors shall be one of the types listed in table 310.41. So those conductors that are inside of it, okay, 3-4, are typically going to be one of the type in here, and I'm telling you what they're actually going to be is they're typically, let me see if I can't close this thing down. Let's see if I can't, how do I get back to it? I think I got away from it. Oh, right here. All right, so typically, let me tell you what you're going to see in NMB. Typically, you're going to see TW or you're going to see a THHN equivalent. But it doesn't have to have the nylon on it, okay? Because you're not pulling it in a raceway, you're not using it for protection or to lower the coefficient of friction during the pull, okay? So basically, did you know when we test that THHN anyway, we have to take off the nylon when we do the water tests? Did you know that? So anyway, so in this case right here, it would be equivalent to THHN, but it just wouldn't have that nylon covering on it, okay? That's typically what you get, either TW or a THHN equivalent. Now, could a manufacturer say, look, I don't want to produce a THHN and take off the nylon? Can I just put the same product in there with the nylon on it? Yes, if you wanted to. And it would probably have markings on that nylon. Because typically the reason that you don't have any markings on the conductors that are inside of non-metallic sheath cable is because there's no nylon for them to apply the markings on it or the numbering, and they don't have to. So that's why typically there's nothing marked on those conductors, which also means that you can't strip those conductors out and use them outside of that cable assembly. Why? Now, of course, you can use small pieces inside of a junction box for pigtails because it's still part of that cable assembly's total installation. But I couldn't pull those conductors out of it and then put them in a raceway. I couldn't sleeve them in the, say, Greenfield or FMC or liquid tight flexible metallic conduit or liquid tight flexible non-metallic conduit, say outside from a disconnect over to an air conditioning unit. You're saying, nobody's looking. I'll just put a piece of NM cable in there. No, that's a wet location. Any raceway outside or raceway outside underground is a wet location. So you can't use NMB for that. Well, that's okay. I'll just strip out the conductors. You can't do that either because none of those conductors are marked. And the code requires the conductors to be marked. That's a problem, right? So keep it in the sheathing and use it in dry locations only. That's the moral of that story, okay? All right, and it says right here, you'll notice that it says that the conductor's insulation shall be rated 90 degrees C. So that's where you get the NMB. See down here in the informational note? It says type NM and NMC cable identified by the markings NMB or NMCB meeting this requirement. That's what the -B means. It's just simply to let you know that those conductors inside of that cable, the insulation's rated for 90, even though you just saw a minute ago that we still can't exceed the 60. But thank goodness for that 90 for adjustment and corrective purposes. Okay, so that's why it's there. So if you didn't know what the -B means, now you do. All right, the sheathing. This is the outer jacketing. It says the outer sheathing of non-metallic sheath cable shall comply with 334.16a and b. All right, well, here's A, our normal non-metallic sheath cable, as many of you say, called Romax. That's a trademark of Southwire. It says the overall covering shall be flame retardant, obviously because it's being installed inside of a building, and moisture resistant. So it's in the compound that makes up the plastic material that's extruded. You have like additives for the moisture resistant, and we put in additives for the flame retardant compounds in there. Okay, and then it mixes it all up, and you add pellets in there. You add some plasticizer in there that makes it pliable, and then you put it under pressure, and you extrude it over those conductors. Okay, so that's what gets done to NM. And then NMC says the overall covering shall be flame retardant, moisture resistant, fungus resistant, and corrosion resistant. So again, we have to put a lot more compounds in that in order to reach all this. Or what else could you do? You could actually, hang in there, Mike. I'm almost done, buddy. Hang in there. I know this was a long one. You would just use UFB in place of NMC. That's all you would do for that. Okay? All right, folks. That's an awful lot of material. I think we went about 2.5 hours. I could go even deeper with non-metallic sheath cable, but I think you get the gist of it. I think you understand it. As always, reach out to me if you have any questions. If you're interested in getting into our Fast Tracks program, check it out. Just go to fasttracksystems.com. We'd love to have you as a student in our program. You get to meet with me every Wednesday night. You get to meet with Schwartzy on Wednesday nights. A bunch of the guys in the group come in. Every week we discuss code and we go over lessons. But if you want to get our videos, exclusive videos, and all the stuff that's coming out in 2023, even this video is going to disappear in 7 days, and it's only going to be available on Fast Tracks Tube. Go down here. If you go and get a free account, you may get lucky and be drawn, okay? You may be drawn for a free membership, $125 value. So go register and get a free account, and the next time you log in, guess what? You might see that everything's open. What does that mean? You were picked. All right, folks, I appreciate you. Sorry for the long show tonight. Till next time, stay safe. God bless.